Stockholm, Sweden, June 12, 1972. Mrs. Indira Gandhi, Prime Minister of India, arrived today to address the first United Nations Conference on the Human Environment. She was met by the Secretary General of the conference, Mr. Maurice Strong, who escorted Mrs. Gandhi to the rostrum.
It is clear that the environmental crisis which is confronting the world will profoundly alter the future destiny of our planet. No one amongst us, whatever our status, strength, or circumstance, can remain unaffected.
Stockholm, Sweden, June 16, 1972. An international group of young people assembled today in Sergels Torg Square to publicize what they called the worldwide competition to pollute. They awarded a series of prizes to the Olympic champions of pollution.
The first award for each category is a lead medal. The second place is mercury, and the third, cadmium. May we have the first award for automobile pollution? Can you read out? Come forward.
The awards in the case of automobile pollution, lead medal to General Motors, USA. Yay! Special dishonorable mention for Toyota Motors of Japan.
For 11 days in June 1972, Stockholm was a magnet for everyone concerned with the environment. 1,200 official delegates from 113 nations were in Stockholm for the first international conference on the human environment. The meeting, first proposed to the United Nations by Sweden and approved by the General Assembly in 1968, attracted worldwide attention. In 4 short years, the topic of the human environment had gone from the back pages of newspapers to make headlines on page 1. On the first day, the official delegates assembled for the opening ceremonies in the Royal Opera House, where in the presence of King Gustav Adolf, they listened to the Secretary General of the United Nations, Mr. Kurt Waldheim.
Ladies and gentlemen, everything is of concern to everybody in our deeply interdependent world today. The iron rule remains. Our world is one, inseparable, and interdependent. It is this world that is threatened by the impact of man's unplanned, selfish, and ever-growing activities. No political system makes us immune to this threat. No level of economic development permits us to escape. We all face the challenge of equals, equally threatened, equally vulnerable. The crisis of human environment is a global crisis.
The whole city of Stockholm was caught up in the conference. The conference symbol appeared everywhere, and the pre-conference publicity brought thousands of unofficial observers from all over the world to Stockholm. The government of Sweden provided facilities for all of them. At Skarpnäck, an abandoned airfield on the outskirts of town, it even set up a tent city for the many young people who could not pay for lodgings. Members of official delegations were supplied with new model Swedish cars. But this was a different kind of conference. The delegates were also offered the use of 200 bicycles, ecologically a more apt means of transportation. On the 5th of June, the delegates came together in the huge meeting hall of the Folketshus for the first plenary session of the official conference.
I declare open the United Nations Conference on the Human Environment.
The preparatory committee had chosen 6 major areas of deliberation: human settlements, resource management, identification and control of international pollutants, development and the environment, education and information, and future organizational needs. As the first order of business, the delegates elected a president by acclamation. They chose the head of the Swedish delegation to the conference, Mr. Ingemund Bengtsson.
The attention of the world is now directed at us in Stockholm. Let us therefore fulfill the justified expectations of the peoples of the world that this conference will lay a lasting foundation for the continuing efforts which we must undertake to ensure a better quality of life for all.
The eyes and ears of the world were indeed trained on Stockholm. Radio and television reports from the conference reached millions around the world. The official meetings were held in 3 separate conference buildings. But Swedish radio and television also carried the scores of non-official events happening all over the city. But the theme of the conference, Only One Earth, was seriously compromised by a technical question. Because East Germany was not yet a member of any United Nations body, it was invited to be present without the right to vote, while West Germany, a member of the World Health Organization, was given a regular seat. Because of this, the Soviet Union and most Eastern European countries stayed away from Stockholm. Many delegations expressed grave concern.
It is a matter for regret to us, indeed, as it must be to all the delegations present here, that the USSR and some countries of East Europe are not present at this conference, which concerns entire mankind.
How can we talk seriously and realistically of the problems of resource use and of the problems of pollution in our only one Earth without the representatives of these countries?
The very fact that the conference began with 113 participating countries with very high-level delegations from those countries, this in itself represented a very significant step forward, because this demonstrated more than anything else the real concern of the majority of countries in the world. And those countries which did not participate in the conference did not remain away because they were disinterested in the issue. They remained away because of another political issue that didn't have any direct relevance to environment. So those who were here because they were interested. Those who were not here because they weren't interested in the environment issue.
But there were also a great many non-governmental groups interested in the environment. For them, the Swedish government set up a number of conference sites around Stockholm. Of these, the most prominent was the Environment Forum, where anyone could register and participate.
Well, the Environment Forum is an unstructured conference, which makes it different from the United Nations conference, in that people can get together and contribute what they want to contribute. And in order to enable them to contribute, there have been the workshops set up, so that people who are interested in a particular subject can get together and discuss these subjects. A manifesto was brought together by a meeting of workshop leaders and was sent to Lady Barbara Ward Jackson, and its ideas incorporated in a further document which is being presented to the United Nations, a non-government organization document which is longer than this and is being presented to the United Nations today.
There would then be an increase in resource prices as a result of...
There were also larger meetings at the forum. International panels of speakers debated environmental questions on everything from ecocide to the politics of pollution. The audience was encouraged to ask questions and add their own ideas.
Just to amplify a little bit, the flush toilet, to take a homely example, is not political. When I, or a commissar in Moscow, or a capitalist in Tokyo, or a religious leader in India flush our body wastes down into the public water supply, we are all equally guilty of stream pollution, regardless of the form of political organization we happen to live under.
I would not say I am disappointed. I think under the circumstances, 4 years after politicians in particular and people in general began to realize we were in the middle of an environmental crisis, I think Maurice Strong has done an absolute miracle of even getting people to come here and putting together this sort of conference. At the same time, we have to be extremely critical of the point of view that simply turning the old economic crank faster is going to somehow close the gap between the rich and the poor. We've tried that particular game. We've tried it now for 20 years or so, and proportionally the rich keep getting richer and the poor do not catch up.
Someone is going to have to pay the debt, and people are scrambling to see that the other fellow pays. So we're beginning to divide up, and I think we begin to see industry and labor and consumers beginning to take very sharp sides on these issues. It's become, I think, a very basic and quite dangerous political issue because it leads very quickly to fundamental concerns that we've tended to push under the rug. The question of the validity of the private enterprise system, for example. The question of whether we can tolerate wars. Questions of racial discrimination. These are things that we tend to avoid talking about, but the environmental issue sort of casts a bright light on them, making them very difficult to avoid.
And let me point out to you that the old corny economist argument that we are doing an enormous favor to various third world countries by buying their minerals from them is just plain ordinary hogwash. We, in the rich nations, eventually will have the energy, we think, and the technology to provide substitutes when the high-grade minerals are gone, leaving the third world holding the bag if we continue to go on down that route. It's quite clear to me, I think it's quite clear to most ecologists who have looked at the situation, that you cannot separate the question of the rich and the poor from the question of preserving the world's environment.
I think the developing countries begin to realize that they have been victimized ecologically, so to speak, by colonization, that the population explosion is in effect the last remnants of the harmful influence of colonization on the colonies. And the proposition, which I believe will come up at the official conference here, for ecological reparations, I think is a just idea, which the developing countries are putting forward, and which I think reflects very clearly their proper understanding of the ecological base of their difficulties.
It must be realized that integration of environmental control programs in the economic development program of developing countries will call for additional resources which are already limited in these countries. We believe that if developed countries are genuinely interested in the improvement of the overall human environment, for after all, we all live in one world, this extra burden should be partly shared by the developed countries.
The developed countries must understand that countries engaged in an all-out struggle to improve the well-being of their people and which are deeply concerned with problems of development tend to see strict environmental controls as a luxury which they cannot afford.
The major problems of the physical environment in Ghana are not those caused by industrial pollution or the spoliation of pleasure beaches by oil from huge tankers, but the simple, elementary ones of biological pollution, such as the disposal of human excreta and the removal of disease-bearing organic matter from drinking water. In fact, in most areas of Africa, the provision of safe potable water is the most important physical problem of the environment.
Countries with but a small fraction of the world's population consume the bulk of the world's production of minerals, fossil fuels, and so on. Thus, we see that when it comes to the depletion of natural resources and environmental pollution, the increase of one inhabitant in an affluent country at his level of living is equivalent to an increase of many Asians, Africans, or Latin Americans at their current material levels of living. The inherent conflict is not between conservation and development, but between environment and the reckless exploitation of man and earth in the name of efficiency.
If poor nations are faced with the problem of growth within acceptable environmental limits, the rich nations are clearly caught up with it even more seriously. We're meeting in this worldwide conference largely because the evidence is now overwhelming that roughly a century of very rapid economic advance throughout the world has contributed to a monstrous assault on the quality of life in the developed countries.
We have got to learn to live with stabilized populations, with a more modest use of resources, and we cannot cheat by simply saying we're going to carry on with the same division as we have now, because if 2/3 of humanity, as our delegates have been telling us again and again today, if 2/3 are to stay poor so that 1/3 can stay rich, my friends, they won't do it. It's as simple as that.
It has been my experience that people who are at cross purposes with nature are cynical about mankind and ill at ease with themselves. Modern man must re-establish an unbroken link with nature and with life. He must again learn to invoke the energy of growing things and to recognize, as did the ancients in India centuries ago, that one can take from the earth and the atmosphere only so much as one puts back into them. In their hymn to earth, the sages of the Atharva Ved chanted, "What of thee I dig out, let that quickly grow over. Let me not hit thy vitals or thy heart." So can man himself be vital and of good heart and conscious of his responsibility. I thank you, Mr. President.
We talk about quality of life. Well, quality of life is based upon what people think is most important when they're called upon to decide. Now, we've gone out of the period when we can just simply think that anything is possible. Man has sobered up somewhat, and the environment issue has made him realize that he does have to make very hard choices. He hasn't got it made. He can't have it always. He's got to decide, and in deciding, it's the deeper sense of values which is finally going to determine what he decides. Now, I believe that the general public has sensed this. They have realized, I think, when they see a dirty beach, when a little child points up the fact that, "Daddy, look at the water's dirty," when they sense the fact that despite the tremendous material progress that has been made in some of our societies, that actual living conditions have deteriorated, the number of alternatives available for the citizen in his private life in many of the cities of the world have actually diminished. He realizes that pure material economic growth is not the answer, and it makes him confront the basic questions of values.
There are certain ecological principles that cannot be ignored, or if they're ignored, it will only be at our peril. Principles that I would like to call the laws of nature. Too often recently, we have transgressed these laws, and we are beginning to suffer accordingly. The wilderness areas and the rich variety of creatures and vegetation that inhabit them are dwindling rapidly, and with their disappearance, mankind will have lost an important and vital part of its heritage. Great interest has been aroused at this conference and at many of its attendant manifestations in the plight of the great whales.
One of these manifestations took place at the tent city. The keynote speaker at this whale night was Walter Hickel, former U.S. Secretary of the Interior.
The United Nations can do. And I think it would be a crime beyond belief that in the same decade that man had the technology to walk on the moon, he destroyed the largest animal on Earth. And so
But there was also an unexpected visitor from the official conference.
The United Nations organization has learned a lot from this experience, and one of the things we've learned is that we need new and better techniques of relating ourselves to the citizens groups and the non-governmental organizations, and I think this conference will show us better how to do that kind of a job, and I hope that you will continue after Stockholm the activity that you've started here. Because if we stop here, if we let government stop here, if we let international organizations stop here, if we let people stop here, it won't be long before some of the worst predictions that we've been hearing may well be upon us.
Are we going to hear from our governments that they're going to sign the Environmental Declaration, that they're going to look after the oceans, that they're going to take a new look at the redistribution of world resources? Okay, it sounds splendid, but what guarantee have we that you don't mesmerize yourself by saying a thing is going to happen and then somehow kid yourself that it has happened? It hasn't happened, it will be very difficult, and it'll only happen, in fact, if there are enough citizens and enough people in this world who have this new vision and are prepared to stay with it, not only when they are young, but when they are infinitely decrepit. In other words, right through and right on. And to me, the great importance of Stockholm is the fantastic number of people who've come to this place under their own steam, under their own expense, because they want to participate in saving the planet that they love.
You pay your own way here?
Yes, I did.
There are many people doing that. Why do they do it?
Well, I've done it because I have materials. I have a film on Hawaii that I want to show. I'm showing this afternoon. I made specifically for this forum. I want to show what the problems are in Hawaii, and perhaps through showing it here, bring attention to the problem at home.
There were many who felt that coming to Stockholm would draw world attention to their own problems. Among them, a group of victims of mercury poisoning from Minamata, Japan, engaged in a campaign against the industrial firm that had caused their affliction.
We heard about this environmental convention here.
There was also a group of American Indians from Black Mesa, Arizona.
We were able to make it here because we want to bring this message to the world because of our knowledge of ancient knowledge that's foretold that if we do not stop these things now, we're going to suffer a great many problems later, and it may be that nature will take over.
We have been in contact with the Environmental Forum.
The group had come to Stockholm to try to stop the further expansion of a huge power station complex in the Midwest of the United States, which many feel is already one of the world's biggest air polluters.
I believe that if we're going to succeed in this task of better managing our own activities on this planet, we have to do on a much larger scale what we started to do in Stockholm, and that is involve citizens, involve scientists, involve people in their private roles in the whole process by which society decides in which direction it has to move.
May I take it that the conference adopts these recommendations?
In 11 long days and nights, the conference accomplished all it had set out to do. It approved an Earthwatch program to measure and identify environmental problems on a worldwide scale, as well as an action plan to protect man and his habitat from further degradation. But the committee working on the Declaration on the Human Environment had been given the hardest task.
Mr. President, the working group on the Declaration met until 5 a.m. this morning.
To draft a set of guiding principles for the preservation of our planet, one that more than 100 jealously independent nations could agree upon, was a major achievement. In its final form, the Declaration contained a preamble and a set of 26 principles stating, among others, that man has a right to an environment of quality and the responsibility to protect and improve that environment for future generations. That environmental deficiencies caused by underdevelopment could best be cured by development, and that nations should cooperate to develop international laws to compensate victims of those forms of pollution that cross national boundaries.
May I consider that in view of the spontaneous approval of the representatives, it is the wish of the conference to adopt the draft resolution by acclamation? It is so decided.
The countless concerned people who have watched us must see us, representatives of governments, as moving with an agonizing, almost dreamlike slowness. But move we do, and that's news, and it's good news. The momentum of action by governments is at last beginning to swing around to confront the questions that have been waiting years to claim our attention. What, sir, is to be our message to the world? Our report will go to many addresses, to the United Nations and its agencies, to governments and scientific organizations and universities and specialized groups of all kinds, all of them involved in essential ways in this most comprehensive of human concerns, the environment of man. But what of the other addressee, and the most important of all, the people of the world?
I think the lasting message of the Stockholm Conference will be the realization that man has come to one of those seminal points in his history where his own activities are the principal determinants of his own future, and where he realizes that he has got to subject those activities to a much more responsible management and control than he has in the past. And this has tremendous implications, not only for his relationship with the natural systems on which his life depends, but more particularly for his relations with his fellow man on this planet. And I think the awareness of this and the beginning of a program of international action to deal with this will be one of the most durable effects of the Stockholm Conference.
A few days later, the visitors were gone, and the city was back to normal. But for many people, Stockholm will always be connected with the first international attempt to do something about environmental problems.